So if you had the chance to read the physical paper of the Sunday New York Times this weekend, this is what you saw staring back at you. Front page, above the fold, this striking large headline, Democracy Challenged. Twin threats to governing ideals put America in uncharted territory. From that extraordinary piece of reporting by our friend David Leonhardt, this. The first threat is acute, a growing movement inside one of the country's two major parties, the Republican Party, to refuse to accept defeat in an election. The second threat to democracy is chronic but also growing. The power to set government policy is becoming increasingly disconnected from public opinion. Joining us now, the author of that new piece, New York Times senior writer David Leonhardt. David, thank you so much for being here. I just confessed that the first time I picked up, the story was online before my paper arrived, and I went to read it, and I got depressed, and so I waited till my paper came in the morning, and I read it in the paper. It's really important, though. Take me through these two serious blows to our democracy.
Yeah, it's very alarming. I mean, I think of myself as an American optimist. I think the long-term history of the United States mostly offer reasons for optimism. But this is really worrisome. So, as you said, there are basically two threats. One is the immediate threat, and in the short term, it's the much more worrisome one, which is the idea that large numbers of the Republican Party have signaled that they will not necessarily accept defeat in an election. And the reason this is worrisome is that it raises the possibility that in a future election, potentially as soon as a 2022 race or a 2024 presidential race, Republicans will try to overturn the result the same way Donald Trump tried and failed in 2020. This is just way outside of the norm of American politics and history. Al Gore lost a close, disputed election to George Bush, and he said, okay, it's time to move on. George Bush is the president. Richard Nixon lost a close and in some circles disputed election in 1960 to John F. Kennedy. And he said, okay, I lost. John F. Kennedy is the president. We just didn't have, until very recently, major figures in parties suggesting or even outright saying they would not accept defeat. The second problem is chronic. And in some ways it's built into the Constitution, but for reasons we can get into if you want, it's become just much more problematic now. The Democratic Party has won 7 of the last 8 popular vote in the presidential election. That's an unprecedented streak. No other party has ever done that well. Before this, the best any party had done is 6 out of 8. And the previous parties that have done so well, the Reagan Republicans, which won legitimate landslides, the FDR New Deal Democrats, Thomas Jefferson's Democrat Republicans, the Abe Lincoln Republican Party, when those parties won the popular vote, they got to govern. And for a set of reasons, basically, we now have this disconnect between the popular vote and election outcomes in a way that we have never had before. In the past, we had all kinds of restrictions on who could vote and who was a citizen. Black Americans were excluded, women were excluded. But among the people who could vote, popular sentiment tended to guide who won elections. And now we're seeing a disconnect.
And it is so acute, and I thought of the Supreme Court when I read that section. I don't want to skim over the first one though, and then we'll come back to this, which is really structural in nature. You write that over the sweep of history, the American government has tended to become more democratic through women's suffrage, civil rights laws, the direct election of senators, and more. The exceptions, like the post-Reconstruction period when Black Southerners lost rights, have been rare. The current period is so striking, partly because it is one of those exceptions. There's so much about what you pulled together that, like your point about popular elections, hasn't happened before. Tell me your degree of alarm as you sort of peel back the layers to this. You know, we say these things on cable TV. We're never positive they're true, but it feels like we are in uncharted territory.
I think we are, and which isn't to say that things are worse than they've ever been. In many ways, our democracy is much more inclusive than it was in the past. I mean, in the living memory of large numbers of Americans, there were many parts of this country where Black Americans could not vote, right? In the living memory of our grandparents, women could not vote. So I'm not saying that American democracy is worse than it's ever been. By some measures, it's better than it's been for the vast majority of our history. I think this notion, though, that you have large portions of a party signaling that it might not be willing to accept defeat in an election, that is a fundamental tenet of democracy. And I think a huge part of what will determine where this goes is, one, What about the rest of the Republican Party? We're not talking about all Republicans. According to 538 calculations, something like 40% of Republicans running for office this year are election deniers. That leaves 60 who are not. About 10% kind of play footsie with it. So let's say 50 who are not. Mitch McConnell has been pretty strong on this. He said there is no evidence of widespread voter fraud. The Supreme Court, whatever you want to say about its other decisions, refused to get involved in the 2020 election. And so I think one of the most important group is going to be these Republicans who have not yet signed on to this radical movement to deny elections, and what are they going to do? And then I think liberals and Democrats also have an important role to play here, because it's important to remember that you can disagree on all kinds of issues and still accept democracy. So just to be clear, being opposed to gun control is not anti-democratic. Being opposed to abortion is not anti-democratic. Being in favor of low tax rates for the rich, none of those views are anti-democratic. And I think it's going to be important for Democrats to think about, how do we build a big enough tent to protect our democracy and have people in that tent with whom we disagree strongly on all kinds of high stakes issues, but we all believe in democracy, and we can live to fight another day in the political realm over those issues. But we have no hope if we lose this notion that we are in a democracy where the winner of an election, the rightful winner of an election, gets to take power.
You know, Claire, to David's point, there are disagreements around the three issues he cited. But what Republicans want is for them not to be decided in democratic ways. I mean, they have pushed through, predicated on the big lie, hundreds of laws to change access to the polls. And I want to read you something, Claire. We did our first show on the danger to democracy on this program on September 30th, 2020. Do you remember this, Claire? I won't put you on the spot. I'll remind you. Trump had been asked by Chris Wallace the day before if he would accept the results of the election. And he said this, quote, "I'm urging my supporters to go to the polls and watch very carefully, because that's what has to happen. I'm urging them to do it. I'm urging my people. I hope it's going to be a fair election. If it's a fair election, I'm 100% on board. But if I see tens of thousands being manipulated, I can't go along with that." Headline was that he didn't commit to accepting the results of the election. One of what David reports out is one of the two big threats to our democracy. Claire, you said this: "I believe that in his heart he's a coward. This is not a man of great courage. I think he's a phony. I think he's looking for a fig leaf. I believe he thinks he's going to lose, and he wants to have an excuse because he doesn't want to confront that. He's going to be rejected by the American people." That has infected, in David's numbers, he wrote down 40% of the Republicans running are election deniers, plus 10 that are playing footsie with us. Even my weak math skills gives me 50% of all Republican candidates are in that position that Trump was in September of 2020. How do we, it's a nosedive for democracy. How do we get out of this?
Well, first, let me say I have great respect for David and his work on this piece. And I consumed it, then I went and threw up, and then I thought about it because it is so hard for me, having been part of government for so long, watching it go off the rails like this. And I got to say, he just said in the segment a minute ago, major figures in parties. And it really isn't major figures in parties. It's just one man. Donald Trump did this. He is solely and whole. Now, there are other Republicans that are aiding and abetting him at this point and enabling him at this point and emulating him at this point. But make no mistake about it. This norm, you cited, Richard Nixon accepted it. Al Gore accepted it. Hillary Clinton lost the popular vote, never said I didn't, I was really elected. She didn't do that. I mean, no one had ever in America done what this man did. He is solely and completely responsible, and I will not do both sides on this one. It's Donald Trump and just Donald Trump.